Hi everyone, this is Tori Vandalin with Prevent Connect. On this podcast, we're joined by Dr. Meghna Bhatt, and this time we're talking about street harassment. As Meghna and I talk about on this podcast, street harassment is very pervasive, and it also upholds a lot of the cultural norms that contribute to the high rates of sexual and intimate partner violence that we see, which is why it's important to address and prevent it. Meghna and I recorded our conversation during International Anti-Street Harassment Week 2019, but we hope that you find inspiration from this podcast year-round and during International Anti-Street Harassment Week in 2020. Enjoy!
Probably recognize your voice and recognize your name from your work with Prevent Connect, and now you volunteer with Stop Street Harassment.
That's right.
And as we're recording this, we're in the middle of International Anti-Street Harassment Week. Can you give us an overview of Stop Street Harassment and the work that you do there?
Sure. So Stop Street Harassment is a non-profit organization that is kind of dedicated to tackling and addressing the prevalence of street harassment, and specifically in terms of realizing that it happens every day, and not with the attempt of trivializing it.
Right.
But it's also connected to the other forms of gender violence, right? Because I feel like street harassment gets so normalized on a day-to-day basis that it often gets dismissed or trivialized, or people don't believe it's happening unless it's the person who's been harassed.
Yeah.
And the founder, Holly Curl, who founded Stop Street Harassment, she's been an amazing advocate and ally in terms of and it's not just in the US. I have to mention this goes like global, like it has a worldwide presence. In terms of what Stop Street Harassment does, it's not just about using that platform and space as for those who want to share their stories about street harassment, but also has helped in terms of navigating research studies and policies, and also campaigns to create awareness about what to do when you see someone being harassed.
Yeah.
So I know Collective Action for Safe Spaces kind of partnered with Stop Street Harassment, and I think also the Metro Transit. I think it's the WMTA, but it's like they all collaborated together, and there were other partners, and they came up with this national campaign in the transit, like the bus, the trains and the buses, where you would see ads about are you harassed, or call for this hotline, or what to do when you see someone being harassed. And they actually put faces of those who are, having multiple identities or who are marginalized further. So, for example, you would see faces of, individuals who would identify, as transgender on the posters, or you would see, a photo of a man who wants to be an ally. It's kind of as a role as an ally, or a Muslim woman with a hijab. So I feel like these are these different, kind of in terms of addressing the intersectionality of how street harassment affects everyone, and not just women, but in terms of across all demographics. So they have come up with excellent campaigns and excellent policy work in terms of research and creating anti-street harassment legislation. So and I think more information will be found on the website stopstreetharassment.org. My role came about was I think maybe in 2014 or 13, if I'm not mistaken. I came across the organization, and they were calling out for they were inviting applications for the blog correspondent program. Okay. And that was my first experience with writing blogs. And as most people who know me well, or people who have read my blogs, I love to write. Just as much as I love to speak. But that's just the way I write. It's just been real good use of storytelling. And I applied for the blog program, and I got accepted. So every month for that, for 4 months, I wrote a blog about different aspects, right? From growing up in India, of those experiences kind of influenced my work and who I am right now. to other aspects. And it kind of comes a full circle again, as we were talking earlier, is where, when I was working with Kakas and Prevent Connect, I ended up also doing a podcast and, collaborated further by doing a blog again for the Anti-Street Harassment Week. And then today, another blog that I wrote today came out as a volunteer staff.
Yeah.
So I've been in touch with Holly different times of our kind of journey together from the time I was a blog correspondent, and I'm so fortunate to have that opportunity to collaborate with her, because I got to learn so much from her and the work that Stop Street Harassment does.
Yeah.
And specifically in terms of this week, you mentioned the Anti-Street Harassment Week. We did like a small organizing in Sacramento at the Capitol, where we took photos, we wrote anti-street harassment messages on our boards, and I think it was more to create awareness, spread the word that street harassment happens, and we should all be accountable to kind of stop and intervene.
I've looked around a little bit on the Stop Street Harassment website, and I remember reading the recent research study that came out too, where most people have experienced this, and I think what's so important is that this research then allows us to make more connections between between street harassment and sexual violence. Like you had said earlier about in your dissertation and your research, when people said like, oh, well, sexual violence is only the physical violence, not the
Right.
verbal, emotional. I think people tend to only think of the most physically violent examples when we talk about sexual violence, and they don't think of, so we have street harassment, it's so pervasive, but the same norms and conditions that allow street harassment to happen are also the same ones that allow sexual violence to happen.
That's right.
The flip side of that is that they're both preventable.
Exactly.
So what are some tips or advice that you have for people looking to prevent street harassment?
I think in terms of those situations, I have to mention that this, especially if as a survivor who is being harassed, or someone who's in the situation and I'm being harassed, I feel there's no right or the wrong way of responding, specifically if you are you're being victimized, right? So I feel like sometimes it happens where due to the whole culture of victim blaming and other false myths revolving around how to respond, I feel like sometimes we end up telling survivors you should have responded this way, you should have spoken, and
oh my gosh,
all of us react differently. Healing and justice looks so different for all survivors, and I feel that's important to say, so that that's kind of reduce the possibility of victim blaming.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I learned that later, I learned that in the process too. It wasn't something that came up, but I feel one of the things is also, in addition to keeping in check your own safety and how you're traumatized you are specifically, I feel sometimes just, calling out and acknowledging what the harasser is doing loudly and telling them that this is not okay, or back off. I feel that's sometimes, an important way to kind of distract and kind of delegate the situation to people who are around. If that makes sense. So I feel and it again depends. I have to mention the safety and check in with trauma and self-care, but I feel but as a bystander, I feel there are so many other ways that we can speak about it and intervene, and whether it's calling the authorities or distracting. There was one time where I saw a young girl being almost cornered and followed by this man. And I almost, I was at a bus stop. It's happened in India and happened in the US as well. But I literally went ahead and I kind of looked at her and I started talking to her as if I knew her. Right? And in India, I asked her in our local Hindi language. And she didn't expect someone to come and ask for that. again, that person, the man who is a harasser, he automatically like backed off and realized. And that's the time it happened in the US. I even asked her, I was like, are you okay? Like, is this man troubling you? And I spoke really loudly.
Yeah.
And I felt like that guy like did not expect it, and he just like backed off, and he mumbled something, and we weren't sure like how threatening he could be. We had to be careful.
Oh yeah.
But again, these were public spaces, and sometimes it happens that as a survivor, if I see someone being harassed, it could be triggering to me too, and I may freeze as well, right? But I think the more we all give these tools and techniques to the community, to being accountable, even if they cannot help themselves and reach out, but there are other ways of, as I said, like distraction or being a bystander, delegating or calling out on that, right? There are different ways to do that.
Yeah, it sounds like it's the same skills that folks know from our sexual violence bystander intervention work. I think that's so important to put the accountability on the community to prevent street harassment and prevent violence. Really grateful that the field is moving away from putting accountability on victims and survivors, because we've been doing that for how long, and it doesn't work.
Right,
and it's traumatizing.
Yeah, exactly, and it comes on the shoulder of the survivors of making that change. It's not fair, right?
I know in the instances that I've been catcalled and stuff, or had street harassment happen, like it's happened at busy bus stops, and there's been a lot of people around, and nobody says anything.
Exactly.
Which is disheartening, but I think hopefully we're beginning to see a bit of the tide change, that people look out for each other and know that that street harassment is wrong. So
and I'm sorry, you have to go through the experience. It's been as you said, it's pervasive, happens more often than we give we have an idea about
right.
And I think through the work of Stop Street Harassment and Holly, her advocacy and involvement in this movement, I feel like there's so much to document about it. So I feel like it's necessary for people to share their stories, even if it's anonymous. And I think that's what this website also, the website at least gives that platform for people to share their stories. So we have stories being shared all over the world, and they exactly specify the location and what happened if they feel, and it's sometimes anonymous, or they give a name. And I feel like giving that platform for survivors to share their stories is critical to document its prevalence. Like study, as you mentioned, the 2018 study that was done, highlights the seriousness and the impact of what street harassment has. It shouldn't happen that we're constant. I feel like no individual should go through that, where we are constantly negotiating of what to wear, what route to take, what time of the day to travel, to constantly negotiate our space and our safety. To make sure that we are not harassed. Right? And it's not just young girls and women, but there are those who identify as LGBTQ, QI, and those who belong to occupations that are kind of stigmatized, such as sex work. All of them. I think the concept of the concept of consent should be applicable to all, and that's where I think addressing that intersectionality is so important. It shouldn't just be it shouldn't be just applicable for women from middle class or educated, right? So I feel to acknowledge that is so important in our work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just so reflective of the other sexual violence prevention work that the field is doing too.
That's right.
Making sure that when we're talking about prevention and we're talking about ending violence, we're talking about ending violence for everyone, not just those who have more power and privilege over others, but centering the voices and experiences of those most impacted and seeing, what do they think prevention would work. So.
Right. I think it's an important form, and just to kind of reiterate, as you mentioned with street harassment, or as we spoke about earlier, was using cinema as a tool, or I think any form of prevention work, and specifically when we are dealing with communities directly, I think it's so also instrumental that we give them the tools and resources of how they can have those conversations with their community.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
yeah.
I think just like sending them back home and following up, that's all that are important cogs. But also, I feel giving them like simple like a 1-page sheet, saying that if this is some if like your niece or nephew comes and talks to you about being harassed or being sexually assaulted on campus or whatever the disclosure may be, or if you heard someone else, you see someone else, what are the things you can say and what are the resources that are available.
Yeah.
And I feel somewhere it makes you, I think individuals end up making a conscious step. I feel that makes a big difference in how you shift the culture and change the public perceptions of not trivializing any form of violence.
What resources would Stop Street Harassment or other organizations that you know of that are working to prevent street harassment? What resources do they have that can help facilitate these conversations?
Stop Street Harassment has a large collection of resources, and I feel they have tools of how to respond to harassers. They have just 1-page conversations about what is street harassment, because sometimes I feel it is so normalized that as a community, a lot of us fail to recognize what it means and how it looks like.
Yeah.
I remember, speaking about it as a kid, and one of my uncles said that, take that as a compliment, right? And he is in this privileged space who lives abroad, and I was like, and I had to mention that because it revolves around all these factors. So it's things that, what to say to someone who's being harassed, or what resources. And so I think Stop Street Harassment also was one of the first organizations that collaborated with another organization to have a crisis hotline, both in English and Spanish.
Wow.
Yeah, so I feel like those are, again, I would say outstanding milestones.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you see when it kind of reflects the amount of work that was put in for bringing about these changes. So I feel one of the things that, as a part of the Anti-Street Harassment Week, was one or two of the activities was chalk writing. And I feel like chalk writing on the pavements, on public spaces, using pro-respect, anti-street harassment messages. For example, I'm not your baby, or catcalling is not a compliment.
Yeah.
Or treat me with respect, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like these messages kind of put in these public spaces also as a form of art and activism is so visible in terms of creating that awareness, letting people know that street harassment is to be considered seriously.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned about in terms of the ways of tools and resources, and I think a lot of them is available on Stop Street Harassment, about toolkits, how to participate if anybody wants to volunteer, or write blogs.
Yeah.
Right. I think I've been working there as a volunteer mainly to handle the social media and website stuff, but it's been such a great learning experience, a learning process from the time I've been involved with the organization, and I feel I think it's high time we recognize all these movements as a part of a larger vision and work collectively towards it, right? Not isolating the lesser severe. Severe means the publicly perceived severe forms of violence. So not to trivialize those.
Thank you for sharing all those resources and for having this conversation with us.
Absolutely, my honor. It was a great conversation. So thank you for the opportunity. I had a great time talking about it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.